Right, so we will now move on to our fifth panel of evidence for the bill, and we will now hear from Liam Spender and also Giles Grover, both of whom are going to be joining us online. So could I ask our two witnesses just to introduce themselves and say which organisation they're working with? Can we start with Liam? Liam. This also acts as a technical check, so we can all hear you.
Thank you, Chair. Liam Spender, representing the UK Cladding Action Group and a leaseholder affected by cladding issues.
Liam, we can hear you loud and clear. That's fabulous. Giles?
Hi, good afternoon. My name's Giles Grover. I'm here on behalf of the End Our Cladding Scandal campaign team. Affected leaseholder as well. Been affected for 4 years now, with no end in sight, unfortunately. I'm here to represent the 20 or so resident groups across the United Kingdom.
That's fantastic. We can hear you loud and clear as well. And just a reminder to colleagues that this session lasts until 4:15. And can I call Rachel to start the questioning? Rachel.
Thank you, Chair. And good to have both witnesses here. In my constituency, Luton South, I've spoken to constituents who are affected by unsafe cladding and other fire safety defects, as have many other MPs. So I note in the written evidence you gave to the committee, you set out a number of key flaws, and particularly something that I experienced myself during the passage of the fire safety bill. Many of us asked questions around covering all remediation costs for leaseholders, and we were told that's not the right bill, it needs to fall within the building safety bill, and yet again you've put evidence to us that it's been palmed off again and it's not to do that. Do you just want to elaborate a little bit more on that so we understand it, and any other flaws you think are in the current bill? Thank you. Liam maybe, or Liam first and Giles?
Yes, certainly. Thank you for the question. So, as you picked up in the written evidence, we've set out quite a lot of detail about what we see as the flaws in the bill. But the fundamental issue is the one you've identified. We were promised a solution in this bill that has not materialised, and this bill, in many ways, makes things worse. The key way it makes it worse is it removes any legal doubts that leaseholders, the residents of these buildings, who had no part in the design, no part in the regulation, and no part in the construction, will be held responsible for past, present, and future costs when things go wrong. And that's an appalling failure of public policy. And the panel before us touched on all the difficulties with this complicated machine that's being set in motion with building safety charges and accountable persons and building safety managers. And I fear we're heading for a situation where the building safety bill will become a job's worth charter and leaseholders will be seen as one giant blank check. I'll hand over to Giles to add anything he wants to add.
Thank you, Liam. I suppose I'll try not to take too long, because a lot of this is all about the history since the catastrophic events at Grenfell, where we had many years of government, essentially prime ministers, saying that we must be protected from all costs that we played no part in creating, as Liam said. So those promises carried on for a couple of years, but it's kind of clear that as the scale of the issues widened, more buildings have been trapped in it because they've been built so unsafely, that the government has rowed back on that. So we did see, I think it was 2020, it was a change to unaffordable costs. We had Lord Greenhouse, the building safety minister, telling the select committee in November of last year that, he couldn't really respond and give an answer what affordability went. It was a case of hopefully people won't go bankrupt. So sadly, that's already happened to a number of people. People have lost their homes, had to sell for massive discounts. So the really frustrating thing, and what's really shocked us, although perhaps we shouldn't be so surprised, is the number of promises made during the fire safety bill ping pong process, where a number of ministers, Lord Greenhouse again, kept saying, Kit Malthouse said it, I think it was in February, leaseholders should be protected. It's not the fire safety bill that will be the correct legislation. The building safety bill will address that. Many months of promises, many months of ministers telling the Conservative MPs, potential rebels, that, OK, we'll address this in the building safety bill. The building safety bill's here, and it doesn't do anything to address the problem of historical costs. There's a little bit of tinkering, something positive for the future of the Defective Premises Act, but we're still going to have to pay tens of thousands of pounds of costs, sometimes hundreds of thousands, on issues that go far beyond cladding, as the government as a Secretary of State is known for a couple of years, if not longer. I could go on potentially, but I think I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you.
That's great, and I think Rachel's got a supplementary, and if I might commend Rachel for the way she phrased her question so that it was entirely in order, because she wasn't directly referring to the Building Safety Fund, but she was talking about the affordability of repayments. So that's entirely within order.
Thank you, Chair. Following on from that, I'll ask an open question. We've got, a limited amount of time with you. If there's one thing you'd like to see improved about the bill, what would it be?
Right, who'd like to kick off with that? Giles, do you want to come in?
Yep. The one thing is for the government to finally hold true to its words over the years and legislate to ensure we're protected from historical remediation costs. The intention to protect us was in the draft bill, is in the impact assessment as well. It's now been taken out with the aim of transparency for the building safety charge, but there's nothing still to help people across the country who are actually being forced to pay. Again, bills landing on our doorsteps daily, tens of thousands of pounds. So legislation that finally protect us. I'm sure Liam can go into the McPartland-Smith amendment potentially that will do just that. Thank you.
Liam, do you want to follow that up?
I do, yes. As Giles said, I think what's missing from the bill is everything that's set out in the McPartland-Smith amendments, in particular because the bill is making very clear what the legal responsibilities of leaseholders, the people living in these buildings, are, but it does nothing to make clear what the responsibilities of the people who put these buildings up, who design these buildings. And a critical part of what McPartland-Smith does is, as well as providing money for current faults, is it provides a clear legal remedy if buildings are not built properly in the future. And I think that's something that's it stands out like a sore thumb in the current draft of the bill. That's what's missing. That's what I'd like to see added.
Lovely. That's really, really helpful. Colleagues, Rosie? Sorry. Daisy, I'm sorry, I've done that.
I'll answer to both.
Apologise.
Thank you.
Good thing you've got a good sense of humour.
Yeah, it's fine.
Daisy.
In my constituency of St Albans, I have a number of constituents who have been affected by this issue, and they are facing absolutely crippling costs to do with fire safety remediation, and they have also told me about the impact it's having on the decisions they make about their lives, in terms of not being able to start families, for example, because they can't move house, and people who are suffering from very severe mental ill health. Liam, you mentioned that this bill makes things worse in some respects, so I was wondering if you could just expand on that particular point and maybe talk to us all about the real life impact that you've heard from people who are affected, about how it is affecting them in real life ways.
Well, and you're quite right, Daisy, that the situation is worse and worsening by the day. People are facing existential questions. Do they carry on with their property or not? They're facing unpalatable choices. I think one of the ways that the bill makes things worse is in relation to works that are required to remove building safety risks, an example of which could be cladding. The bill makes clear that they're all recoverable through the ordinary service charge mechanism. So it removes any doubt that leaseholders have to pay for other people's misdeeds, other people's mistakes. And we're already seeing the consequences of that with cladding. So imagine what it will be like with the next thing that comes down the road. People are already facing, you've seen the stories in the newspaper and on Newsnight last week, 6-figure bills. Some people have committed suicide. Others are declaring bankruptcy. There's a pall hanging over these people, and it's a blight on the housing market, which the bill does nothing to address. I'll let Giles add more colour to that answer.
Yeah, so it's, again, everything's a long story, because a lot of us have been trapped in this since very soon after the Grenfell, the events at Grenfell, where buildings were then assessed for ACM, and then everything has just snowballed or got a lot worse. There's every so often there's kind of incremental positive steps in terms of funding, but you have to fight tooth and nail for those. And the amount of people that we speak to, and as Liam says, it's, as you said in your question, Daisy, it's families, it's first-time buyers, there's pensioners involved, people from all walks of life who just who just wanted to fulfil that very British dream of being a homeowner, a flat leaseholder, because leasehold isn't necessarily being a homeowner. But right now, it's a case of just the other day, someone told me that because she's so worried, they've accepted on an under 18 metre building, because there's no detail about the loan scheme, they've accepted an offer that's £35,000 that will actually not pay off their mortgage just to move out. And she's got a little child as well. That's just in Manchester, but across the country. And as Liam said, there have been suicides, and they're through a mixture of reasons as well. But people just feel helpless. We're currently trapped. You start off being financially trapped. Everyone focuses on the finances, but then it's a case of, especially during the pandemic for a year and a half, where you just sat in your flat looking at the walls, just not able to sleep at night, thinking, what happens there if there's a fire? And this is people in buildings of all heights, of all tenures, with defects of all types, because as much as it started the cladding scandal, we're called End Our Cladding Scandal, but it's become a building safety crisis. It's not just cladding, whether it's balconies, internal compartmentation, lack of fire protection steelwork, all of these issues, once identified, once you then have to have a proper fire risk assessment, a type 4 intrusive one, you then start uncovering the lack of regulations, the lack of oversight, the poor developer practice, but we're still being made to pay for it. We're still the ones on the hook for it, despite it being none of our fault. And it's just an absolute disgrace, really. And it's unfathomable, to be honest, that it's still happening, that government they've done something, but they've not done enough to solve this issue for once and for all, to provide that certainty to leaseholders, to the housing market, and just help us just move on with our lives, really.
Thank you.
Great. Mike Amesbury.
Question to you both, Liam and Giles, and good to see you both from afar. Does this bill ensure that the polluter pays, those still receiving billions of pounds worth of government subsidies? Is this clearly outlined in any provision in the bill to ensure that leaseholders are protected and the polluter pays?
The answer to your question, Mike, is no. And the same builders that have put up buildings with this horrific array of defects that we're seeing are still perfectly entitled to draw on the Help to Buy scheme and the recently announced subsidies for affordable housing. There's been no accountability, no payment from the polluter. All that's been offered, which isn't in this bill, and is the residential property developer tax, which we don't know the details of, but it's wholly inadequate. That will only recover 13%, 13% of the estimated £15 billion cost, the bulk of the cost of the current crisis and all future crises, which is what this bill does, is being dumped on leaseholders. I'll let Giles add anything he wants to add.
Thank you, Liam. I agree with Liam. It's not holding them to account at all. It's, again, £2 billion, given the fact that I think the latest figures show approaching £15 billion made by the developers since the catastrophic events at Grenfell. The fact that government has supported them through the Help to Buy scheme, through instantly having a stamp duty land tax relief cut, through saying there's a mortgage guarantee scheme that's a first-time buyers, it's open to everyone. The figure that always bothers me more than anything is the amount of money that the Exchequer loses every year, the billions of pounds lost to the zero rating of VAT on construction. A lot of these things have laudable aims, but do they actually help the market as much? Or, the supply side, they don't really. They're just all about demand. So the point is that the government's kind of happy to, praise the economic effects, the benefits of jobs, the circular flow taxpayer money it hands out to support the construction industry. But for this collective state and industry failure that's affecting hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people, it's taken 2.5 years to get us kicking and screaming, getting a bit of money out of the government every so often. Every year there's a little bit more. They keep telling us we're not going to give you any more, we're not going to help you out, but then we get further. There'll be a point next year, hopefully, where the government will say, okay, here's a little bit more, but everything's just doing a little bit here, a little bit there, and we're not being helped. Why are we being forced into a cladding tax loan scheme? Why isn't the government forcing the developers to pay that? The simple point goes back to it was never our fault. It was never anything we did. The regulations were terrible. The regulations were weak, inadequate. A lot of people knew that for years. The government was advised that for years. The builders were allowed to do whatever they want, cut corners, same package says, race to the bottom, focusing on profits over safety. But now we're the ones on the hook to make that right. I don't get how that's in any way at all fair. So no, we need more funding from the government. We probably need more funding from the developers. We need more funding from the product manufacturers as well. Leaseholders should finally be protected.
That's great.
Kate Oswald.
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon to you both. Can I ask you broadly what your views are on the responsible person or persons? What do you think of the responsibilities placed on them? But more specifically, is it reasonable to expect all accountable persons to be sufficiently knowledgeable to assume the responsibilities in the bill?
That one.
Shall I go first?
Yes, do.
Yes, I think the whole accountable person, responsible person regime hasn't been properly thought out. You can't see, as parliamentarians, the full detail that's being developed behind closed doors with industry. You're being asked to put this through without seeing that detail, how that very important relationship will work. But the fundamental issue with the accountable person and building safety manager is this is a regime you'd expect to find in a petrochemical refinery. It's not a regime you'd expect to find in a residential building. It's totally unsuited to what needs to be done, massively over-engineered, and the costs of that will fall on residents. So the government needs to go back to the drawing board and come up with much more tightly defined duties for these people to avoid a situation where we end up with the advice notes on steroids, which is a real risk.
Add to that.
Yeah, I'd echo those comments. I think the difficulty is, again, the secondary legislation, the guidance, it's still not really there to understand how it will work. There's potentially moral hazard between the roles of those accountable persons, the building safety managers, in terms of how they'll coalesce. You might have different accountable persons and responsible persons depending on the building as well. So it still feels that there's no real effective control, and I don't think anyone really wants to be an accountable person right now. I don't think they'll be able to. It's a competencies required that will be a pretty wide skill set potentially, and I fear that they won't ever be able to get any insurance anyway. So I think we need a lot more work on those, on the accountable person, how it will interact with the responsible person. That's much.
Okay. Sean Bailey.
Giles, thank you so much for coming today, and thank you for your candour in your responses. I want to talk a little bit about how this bill addresses some of the inherent power structural inequalities that we see, and I think particularly when it comes to the industry. So we've heard some broadly speaking, positive overtures in terms of behaviours, how we change them, there are possibilities that are there. I want to hear from you how you think this bill should go further to do that. From a personal perspective, I've seen what those inherent inequalities do on a day-to-day, and have lived through that. So I want to know from you how you feel we can do that, because what it sounds like from what you said in your responses so far is there is a system there that needs to be ripped apart. I want to know from you how you think in this bill and the subsequent legislation that can be done. Thank you, Chair.
Who'd like to start with that? Liam?
Yes, happy to start. Thank you for the question, an excellent question. I think the two critical things to address are you need leaseholder resident representatives on the rule-making bodies, so we don't end up with a situation where industry and government make rules that suit them and pass the bill on to leaseholders, and leaseholders are left with the wholly inadequate tool of having to challenge bills that have already been paid through challenges to the building safety charge and challenge to the service charge. That's number one. Number two, I think well, not you personally, but the government is trying to perform some sort of Frankenstein operation with the Building Safety Bill on a system that's had its day, namely leasehold. There's a fundamental imbalance of power in the leasehold system in favour of landlords. Until you address that, you will not solve the problem of rules being made to suit landlords and bills being passed on to residents with no oversight and no control. And the third thing I think you need to do, and it was I didn't see all the sessions this morning, but the thing Dame Judith Hackett identified in her reports as the culture of box ticking in the industry and the race to the bottom, value engineering, all that sort of stuff. Until that changes, nothing changes. Buildings will continue to be built that are not fit for occupation, and we will end up repeating this cycle at some point in the future. Those are the three things I think need to be changed, and I think the McPartland-Smith amendments go a long way to changing them by introducing those clear legal routes to recovery against builders if they don't do their jobs properly. I'll hand over to Giles.
Giles, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, I think I'd just echo the comments in terms of the whole leasehold structure means we're still at the bottom of the food chain. There's all this talk about the building safety charge, but as Liam said, that ultimately leasehold law, and despite the government thinking there might be protections in landlord and tenant law, we've seen that there isn't the supposed protection that should be, because all the cases are based on the terms of lease that are always written against us. So I think it kind of needs to be an overarching look at, it's not just the building safety charge, it's all about service charges and how they're levied, and to have a bit more control over that and the actual ability to challenge that, rather than saying, okay, you can go potentially to the tribunal, because ultimately the cases that we've seen do that just end up being rebuffed. So I'm still concerned in terms of the insurance issues as well that we're facing now, where there doesn't seem to be enough control around that. We've seen buildings insurance soaring hundreds of %. I'm not sure what protections there are against that happening. We've tried to report it to the FCA, to the CMA, but we're simply told that, the responses aren't as constructive or as helpful as they could be. So I think everything just needs to kind of be looked at again. Even the building safety charge itself, that when it was first drafted, I remember a meeting with one of the deputy directors, MHCLG, saying they didn't really know how much it's going to be. It was an academic exercise. Even the numbers in the current impact assessment say it'll be £16 a month. It might be £42 a month. It might be £26 a month. For existing buildings, it should be more. No one really knows. So it might well be that as some industry figures have started to look at it, it might be hundreds of pounds a month as well. So I think there just needs to be a overarching kind of holistic look at service charges, building safety charges as well. That would be the first thing. I go back to Liam's points about the McPartland-Smith amendments as well. That's what we're hoping that the Conservatives will look at and actually realise that, yes, they must be protected now because they're the innocent people.
Thank you. Ian Byrne.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Liam and Giles, for the extremely powerful evidence, and I really hope you listen to when we come to the amendment stage of this process. I just want to touch on the voice of residents, which we haven't really talked about. So, how important is the engagement of residents' engagement to the operation of the occupation phase of the new building regime? And does the engagement process, which is outlined in the bill, do what's required?
Would you like to come in on that, Giles?
Sure. Thank you for the question, Ian. Resident engagement is key. The whole, I mean, as we saw last night, for those who watched the untold story of Grenfell there, if there'd been sufficient resident engagement before or in 2015, 2016, then would the events of June 2017 have happened? I don't think they would have. So it's important to have resident engagement, but as we've seen, a lot of these things are very much tick box exercises. I think recently, the National Fire Chiefs Council, they updated their guidance on simultaneous evacuation and interim measures such as waking watch to say residents should be consulted, cost-benefit options should be explored. That never happens in practice. So what is there to actually make it happen? The government doesn't want to legislate for a resident group in each building. I can understand the reasons for that, but what's to stop the responsible person, the accountable entities to just say, okay, we tried to engage residents, we put a few flyers up here, we gave a form out, there needs to be more of a positive obligation on them to actually engage residents than there seems to be right now. Liam.
Yeah.
Thank you, and I wholeheartedly endorse all of that. I think the answer to Ian's question is the residents' engagement strategy in the bill is not up to scratch, and the problem is that the rules are being made now by statutory instruments in close consultation with industry. There's no amount of resident engagement strategy or resident engagement vision that can overcome that issue. Once the regulations are made, there will be limited room for manoeuvre. So I think there needs to be resident representation on the rule-making bodies to ensure we actually have a genuine residents' voice rather than a couple of cul-de-sacs that freeholders, managing agents, responsible persons, whatever title they're given under the bill, can lead residents down without there being any meaningful input.
Right. So any other questions from colleagues? Ruth?
Yes,
Cadbury.
I've got a couple. And like many members, I've got a lot of affected leaseholders. My first question is, the McPartland New Clause 4 proposes a building safety indemnity scheme equivalent to the Motor Insurers Bureau. Do you feel that will address some of the challenges about who ultimately pays for the defects, the historic defects in buildings that leaseholders are living in? And will it, do you feel it's going to be suitable to apply to leaseholders, whether they are leaseholders of private owners, housing associations, councils or other? Mr. Spender.
Thank you. Yes, it's the simple answer. The building safety indemnity scheme would be one way of creating a pot of money into which all stakeholders would pay to ensure there was money available to fix buildings with issues in whichever sector they're in, private, public, and whatever tenure they're in, whether they're rented or held on long leases. And that would seem to be an equitable way of doing it. It's one implementation of the idea that the polluter should pay, and that there should be a social insurance scheme in the same way that there is for uninsured drivers. I'll let Giles add anything he wants to add to that answer.
Probably nothing to add to that specific point about that particular amendment. I think, again, I've tried to read the building safety bill, the impact assessment, explanatory notes that many times, but I've not managed to quite necessarily make it way right through the end. But having read the amendments and actually interrogated those McPartland and Smith amendments as well, I think that's one of the ones that would help us. The simple point is about better protection for current and future leaseholders by ensuring that the limitation periods are extended by using legislation such as the Homes Act 1984 as well, that would actually, or was it 1985? That would actually help us. I think the simple one, the one that I really want to see, and I think it should just be a no-brainer, is the one about VAT, because there's one that basically, can't remember which one it was, I'm sure Liam will, but it basically says that the VAT that we've been forced to pay on works, on fire safety, that interim measures, I believe, as well, for the last 5 years, that should be refunded, and should also mean that we are treated the same as the developers and the building owners that can apply for the zero rating, because they've been told that exceptional health and safety reasons apply, so they can be classed as a person constructing status. Would it not be a good start just to put us on that same keel of saying, actually, here you go, the money you spent already, that 20% has been added on, you can have that back, and for future cases where if instances happen where future remediations are funded, it should at the very, very, very least be taxed at 0%. The government's profited, or Treasury's profited from VAT, Treasury's profited from insurance premium tax. Agreeing to that would be one way of showing, actually, we do want to help the leaseholders that are being forced to pay these costs with the additional costs added on.
Thank you, Giles. And I think there you were referring to New Clause 1, which has been tabled
and Amendment 1.
Ruth, did you have a second?
Yeah, I did. I don't know if you heard the evidence from the National Federation of Housing Associations, but one of the issues they have raised is seeking an appropriate mechanism to gain limited and proportionate access to properties for essential safety works where this is not granted by a resident, and that presumably also goes for private landlords of leasehold properties as well as housing associations. Now, clearly that raises a challenge for your members, but also whether the building manager or owner is a resident management organisation or a housing association or private sector freeholder or leaseholder. How do you respond to what the Federation says and presumably other building owners and managers as well?
Thank you. Yes, I did hear that evidence, and I think from a resident point of view, we'd have concerns about making it too easy to gain access into people's homes, potentially for spurious reasons. And you'll see, or you may have seen in the written evidence we've put in, that we suggest there needs to be a very tough statutory code of practice to make clear when powers of entry should be used, and whether that's accompanied with tweaks to the drafting of those clauses, that's a possibility. But I think the key point is that we have a very clear set of rules saying when people can enter private property for safety issues. And I think after we've finished with this panel, you'll be hearing from two eminent housing lawyers who will probably have much more to say, far more eloquently than I, on the topic. And I'll let Giles chip in with anything he wants to add.
I'm not sure I can be more eloquent than you necessarily, but I'll do my best. Yeah, I think having been a property manager for a year and a half, for my sins, the actual difficulty of entering a property, I understand that. I think the point, again, as Liam said in our submission, is that there is a lease generally of quiet enjoyment. However, leases do also say for good estate management generally that you can enter a building within 48 hours. I just don't see how, it doesn't feel there's enough protections to essentially stop accountable persons who want to mitigate their own liability, to stop them abusing these powers as well. I don't know how every single electrical point in every single flat is going to be checked as well. So yeah, I defer to Liam and the other lawyers that you have on later as well.
Thank you.
Sean Bailey.
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to come back on the point that was the really good question that was asked around resident representation, tenant representation, because we know when this is done well, it ensures that people can live in safe communities and have make those representations that they need to. We also know what it looks like when it's done horrendously wrong, and the power of a few is collated around a small minority that seem to dictate what happens for everyone else in a community. Can I just ask to both of you, really, where should the driver be to ensure that tenant representation is effective? Should that be prescribed downwards from national government in the context of this bill? Should there be a mix of, because, for example, we have so many different types of ownership, of tenant model. I have 3 in my own local authority alone that are utilised. How do we ensure that every single person that needs that representation actually gets it? And where should that prescription be coming from? From national government down or local government upwards? How do we do that? Because at the core of this, as you said in response to me before, it's that key of ensuring that those communities are accurately represented. So I'd just be interested to hear both your thoughts on that. Thank you, Chair.
You've unmuted.
I have, yes. Perhaps jumping the gun. Thank you for the question and for engaging with the detail on this. As you say, it's vitally important, and there's no one better placed than the people living in buildings to have a view on what's safe and what they think it needs to be done to make it safe. I think there does need to be clearer language in the bill about taking into account the resident's voice, because at the moment a lot of it is passive. It's about being given information, and it's about being given not particularly good rights of consultation. And there needs to be something in the bill that creates a genuine partnership between the managers and the people living in the buildings. And to reiterate the point I made in previous responses, they need a voice on the groups and the committees that are making the rules. So from the ground up, from the get-go, that voice is shaping the rules as they're made, rather than just being presented at the other end. And the last point I'd make is there needs to be more better and more readily accessible advice for leaseholders, for tenants, and whether there can be specific programs set up to provide that advice, so people know where to go to get help when things aren't working, so we don't end up with a situation where relationships break down, where we can actually have that genuine partnership. I think that would be a helpful addition as well. And I'll let Giles add anything he wants to add.
Thank you, Liam. Yeah, I'd probably echo all those comments. I've again seen for myself the difficulty of engaging all residents, the turnover as well, the absent leaseholders that you might have. So I appreciate it might be difficult to do on a statutory basis, but there could be a lot more guidance and help provided to those responsible persons to actually say, how do you do that? I think in general, whether with this point about engaging residents or in general tackling the issues that we're still facing in terms of the fire safety in our buildings, I think there probably needs to be a lot more partnership with local and central government as well. It's the local governments, local authorities, the fire services as well that are able to be more reactive, can be on the ground as well, and can actually have that relationship already with the responsible persons, with the managing agents. It's that whole approach of saying, okay, this is what central government's doing, this is what local government's doing, supported by the fire services. I think that could actually help drive a lot of it forward, given those councillors as well will have that local knowledge. They're the ones that residents turn to directly, as well as their MPs. So I think it could be a lot better. Engagement with all stakeholders could be a lot better than it seems currently designed to be.
Great. Kate Osborne.
Thank you, Chair. Can I ask you, have you considered or anticipated any possible increases to service charges or rent as a result of the bill? And if so, do you have any idea of what that impact might look like to you as leaseholders or tenants? Thank you.
Yes, so I think the simplest answer to the question is we can expect costs of living in higher risk buildings, howsoever defined, to be significantly higher in the future than it is today. I don't think we can really give any credence to the government's estimates that it's going to be, not between £9 and £26 a month. If you read the press articles, some of which are quotes from industry figures you'll be talking to next week, they're already talking about £500 a year extra just to pay the administrative costs of the new regime. And it might not sound like a lot of money, £500 a year, but for some people, particularly shared owners who struggle to get on the ladder, that's make or break money. It's a lot of money if you haven't got it, is one way of describing it. And it needs to be that sort of burden. If it was being imposed on a company, there would be uproar about it, and there would be a great deal more scrutiny of it. But billions of pounds of costs are being loaded onto leaseholders as a result of the new regulatory regime. And the question that needs to be asked is, do we really need to spend that money? Do we really need to spend other people's money, people who may struggle to pay, on this particular issue? I'll hand over to Giles and let him add anything he wants to add.
Thank you, Liam. It's difficult to consider it because last year, again, it slightly changed, where last year it was including the historic remediation costs, and there was some vague, wide-ranging, heavily caveated figures about what it might be. Those figures are still heavily caveated. I suppose the difficulty I have is thinking about, okay, the future building safety charge, when I've got to pay a lot more already, where a lot of people are already paying, as I said, hundreds of pounds already. So it's kind of hard to have this conceptual thought about what may come in place when I'm already facing the hundreds of pounds a month. So I think until there's more clarity about what there actually is, until there's more control over the building safety charge, then I think I won't really consider it until I've got the problems that are facing right now and the thousands of pounds I have to pay right now resolved. My simple answer.
Thank you. Unless there are any other questions, we've got a couple of minutes left at the end, and I just wanted to say to Giles and Liam, is there anything else you wanted to add which we haven't yet covered? You've just got a couple of minutes each to be able to do that, which would be really helpful to us. So anything you feel we should have questioned you on, but we haven't covered yet. Over to you. Liam.
Thank you. Yes, I think the one thing that we would have liked to have spoken about, but we've not had the questions to do it, is the issue of how the bill affects the housing markets and whether it creates, in addition to the cost that is being loaded onto leaseholders, is whether it actually affects the functioning of the market. We already know, and we've made references to that in our written evidence, that banks are starting to make extra provision in their books because they think mortgages are worth less as a result of their exposure to cladding. And if you ask me, that's shades of 2008 when we had an enormous banking crash. So I suppose the issue for Parliament to consider when it's considering this legislation is what is the effect of the economy on the economy of one, not putting up enough money, not by a long shot, to fix the current cladding issues, and two, then creating this enormously complex machine which may not be suited to the task. I don't think it is, and I don't think many people think it is. What is the effect of that on the housing markets, and in turn, what is the effect of that on the wider economy? And does Parliament really want to make that choice without knowing and considering that impact? And I'll hand over to Giles to add anything he wants to add.
Thank you, Liam. So yeah, just on that point as well, I think it was November 2020 before the Chancellor's spending review where we wrote exactly on that point to point that out that the shades of the 2007-8 financial crisis were starting to become clear, and the impact on, say, regulatory capital of the banks with mortgages being valued at zero, the increasing number of forfeitures we saw reporting earlier this year, the impact of flat sales transactions. I think they were halved in September 2020. So, as Liam says, the effect on property prices, especially in the north, I'm from Manchester, and the property prices will be lower, but that means that the actual remediation costs are much larger. So I think that hasn't really been considered. There's the loan scheme as well, which I guess might not be part of the building safety bill, but we still have no idea how it's going to work, how it won't materially impact property prices. The other thing I'll just pick up on, which is in the building safety bill in terms of the measurement of height, and height being the determinant of risk. So I think it was Sir Ken Knight did say earlier that height was a crude threshold. Robert Jenrick said on 20th of January 2020 that it was an arbitrary threshold as well. It might be important, but there are other factors. There's talk of PAS 9980 that will help with that. But as was mentioned earlier today, the fire at Richmond House, Worcester Park, where I think it's under 11 metres and it was completely destroyed in 10 minutes. So what we need, rather than just having, higher buildings, understand you might have to phase a scheme in, but we need a solution for all buildings. We need proper risk matrices that actually look at building risk holistically, that look at occupancy, that look at means of escape, that don't just say, okay, a little bit, you've got cladding here. What about the internal issues? What about the cavity barriers? What about the lack of sprinklers? One example that we've suggested before is, rather than force people in buildings under 18 metres or between 11 and 18 metres to pay a cladding tax, why not ensure that you have sprinklers there in those buildings? That is now part of ADB because government has realised the clear safety principles of it. That would actually go a long way towards helping many of the people in the under 8 or 11 metres to 18 metres buildings. One final point, we need to ensure all buildings, not just this, over 18 metres, 11 to 18 metres, because under 11 metres are still potentially very unsafe. Thank you.
Well, if there are no further questions from members, can I, on behalf of the whole committee, thank you, Liam and Giles, for both taking the time to join us this afternoon, but also for your incredibly comprehensive and thorough answers to the questions that have been posed. We're very grateful for that first-hand insight that you have, and I will let you get on with the rest of your afternoons. So thank you for joining us. And so that brings to a close the fifth panel of witnesses, and we